My name is Kate Lewis. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and I'm here to introduce, in a matter of seconds, the Future of Motorsports panel. We have some exciting guests here with us today. We have David Kanice from Sport Vision, Eric Allen from Pit Row, Giacomo Corbo from Quantum Black, J.R. Hildebrand, IndyCar driver, and Michael Nelson from Penske Racing. And lastly, our panel will be moderated by Scott Burton from ESPN The Magazine. The panel is supposed to run till 10. We might go to a few minutes after just to make up for some time. If you have any questions throughout the session for the panelists, you can send a tweet using Q205 and then hashtag SSAC13. And with that, we're going to hand it over to Scott and begin.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks to all the panelists for being here. Thank you to everybody for showing up. This is going to be a really exciting conversation. I'd be stunned if I got to 10% of the questions I want to ask today. So I don't want to delay. Let's kick right in. It's a way of kind of giving some perspective on what you guys do. My opening question is an easy one. Tell me something interesting or surprising that you've learned since the start of the season. It could be about the Daytona 500, it could be from testing, it could be about a new technology. Anything interesting or surprising? Why don't we start with you? Yeah.
Well, from Sport Vision's point of view, it's just the storytelling that we're looking to do with our data. So we've been in the sport for over 10 years, and we've seen that data is becoming more and more important. Our partners are telling us they want more data to describe what's happening in the race. So we see that as a big event for 2013, being able to tell better stories with the data, understanding what's happening on the track, and giving fans a better perspective of what's really taking place.
Cool. Eric?
Yeah, I'll unfortunately do a little Me Too on David's stuff here. I think we founded Pit Row, some fellow classmates of mine from MIT and I, we had been very interested in baseball, and we saw the incredible amount of data that's available in NASCAR, and the opportunity to do analysis on that to increase fan engagement and increase the fan experience. One of the examples I could give is real-time win probability. This is something that's been very popular, first of all, in poker. I believe this has probably started it, but now you see it in baseball and football. So that's something that at Pit Row we've been developing a real-time win probability algorithm based on where you are in the race, how far you are behind the leader, how many cars there are in front of you, and then the established team strength of the race team. Those types of stats are what we are continuing to push at Pit Row.
Yeah, well, I was on your site after the Daytona 500. It's interesting, right? Because you have a stat called points added, which basically you sort the drivers based on the number of points they added during the race. And it wasn't Jimmy Johnson who was number one. Who was number one?
I believe Kevin Harvick was number one. That's an additional a stat we've been working on, parsing out the value that a driver brings independently of the team is something that's another very interesting question. It's something that has been done in baseball and basketball as well. There's an algorithm available that's already been done in basketball called adjusted plus minus. That's really a great technique to split out the contributions of five, in basketball, the 5 players on the court. And what we do in NASCAR is a similar thing where you've got the driver, the team owner, the crew chief, and then the car manufacturer. And how do you independently split out the contributions of those 4 groups? There's a big correlation issue in the sense that the same drivers and same teams tend to race together a lot. But if you take a long enough sample of data and do some, interesting statistical techniques, you can kind of break that out. And what we find is the driver, in NASCAR anyways, is the largest contributor to a team's success, followed by the owner.
Actually, what I was hoping to get out of you is there's some metric in which Danica was number one. What was that metric?
Oh, I'm sorry. We have I apologize, I'm taking all the time up here. We've got a stat called True Rank, which looks at a team's green flag speed and their time in the pit and adds up that amount of time. So independent of cautions, if there was no cautions, you would expect that you would only be racing under green flag conditions or being in the pit stop. If you add up all that time, that's their true, and compare all the drivers, that's their true rank. Danica's team last week actually had the fastest green flag speed of any team and spent the least time in the pits. So from that perspective, we would have expected Danica to win the race. The fact that she finished 8th is a little bit unlucky.
Cool. Giacomo, what have you learned since the beginning of the season that surprised you or is interesting?
Well, I'll take a slightly different perspective, perhaps a broader perspective, and talk about, one of the things that's really surprising right now my background is in Formula One, so we work, Quantum Black works with a number of different Formula One teams, and preseason testing is ongoing now. So in fact, they're finishing up the last Barcelona test this week. And what is amazing is how close it is at the front of the field, and how much faster the cars have been getting over the last few years, even though you've had an effective freeze on the rules, on aerodynamic rules, since 2009. And you effectively have huge restrictions on the amount of testing that teams can do, and yet they keep finding a way to develop their cars, and yeah, at an incredible rate. And I think that's a testament to something going on in Formula One, in motorsport more generally, and perhaps across a number of other industries, even more broadly than that. And that is how teams are learning to make effective use of data. And when we're talking about Formula One, it's effective use of telemetry, ever more sophisticated models that use this data and that they can bring back to the factory and look at, well, what was the marginal impact of, let's say, this component or that component. And the increasing use of this data gleaned from cars running around the track to calibrate virtual models of the car, to make better use now of simulators that effectively create these synthetic data sources against which they can still develop. So the fact that teams have been stopped from testing in the way that they would like, I mean, as far back, I mean, when I first went into Formula One in 2006, it was perhaps the last year in which teams sort of had their heyday of actual testing. And preseason involved many, many more tests, flights out to Barcelona or Jerez or Valencia. And now and during the season, there were restrictions then, but still very, very few restrictions on the amount of in-season testing. I mean, 2006 was last year in which you had the tire war between Michelin and Bridgestone at the time. And a lot of these tests were consumed with trying to work out what tire compounds either tire manufacturer should bring. But even though, and teams cried foul when this was stopped, when the FIA, which is the governing body, tried to regulate all this and tried to impose these testing bans, mostly for cost considerations. And the fact is that while teams cried foul on one hand, they have found an effective way to compete.
JR, to you.
Well, I mean, I think I would really just piggyback off of what Giacomo talked about. The across the board in motorsport, testing is looked at, off-season testing, in-season testing outside of race weekends is looked at one of the most straightforward ways to cap costs that are being spent, and that's generally due to create more parity between teams that have massive budgets that could go test 30 or 40 days during the season and teams that can test 5 or 10 days during the season. But what we've seen because of that is a much more efficient and optimized use of the data that we do have available, and to Giacomo's point, a little bit of a higher priority on figuring out what exactly we can learn from all that data that's on the car, and what type of data that we don't currently have could we go out and get. And I think that from the driver's perspective, it's a very interesting juxtaposition of what we do inside the car and what we do outside the car, because as a driver, you really look forward to those on-track test days to figure out what the track's going to be like, getting used to changing conditions and these types of things. So as that goes away, the drivers also have to adapt to less available testing, and figuring out means that we can sort of stay sharp and continue to learn when we aren't on the racetrack. So I think those are things that have been happening over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, but will continue to be even bigger focuses, I think, across the board going forward.
Cool. Mike, you just got back from Daytona 500. What was your takeaway from the
Well,
weekend?
there were a few surprising things. We've got a new car, they call it the Gen 6 race car, and going into the race, I really expected there to be more of a spread or a difference between the different makes, the different teams. Everyone has a new platform to work on, so hopefully some guys, or we thought maybe some guys would do a better job than others. If you look at the qualifying times from the Sunday prior to the 500, the times were as tight as I've ever seen them. And our best car qualified 9th, and we were hundredths from 3rd place. You know, just a small amount of lap time made a huge difference in where you qualified. And I was really surprised by that. I thought there'd be a bigger spread in the qualifying times. And so we're actively trying to gather more data, try to understand this new car better. So we need to find out as quickly as we can, do the existing trends for this car match what we've seen in the past or not. So I was really surprised with how the qualifying or the speed of the cars. I think you saw some of that in the race. There are only a couple cars at different periods of time that could make moves by themselves. A lot of guys stayed in line around the top, which is not exactly exciting for the fans. But it all worked out well to be an exciting race in the end. But again, I'm very surprised by how well everyone, or how closely everyone has adapted to that new car so far.
Yeah, well, that kind of leads me to the theme I'm hoping to develop in this conversation. You know, fans are always fascinated about where good drivers come from, how you tell you even have a good driver. Eric, my question to you is, I think we all get, you can't just look at the final standings and say that's the best driver, that's the second best driver. So much goes into where a driver finishes beyond their skill. What kind of metrics have you developed to help you tease out what makes for a good driver and who is a good driver?
Okay. Yeah, and I touched upon that a little bit in my previous question. The problems in NASCAR are very similar to the problems that you would face in the NBA or any other racing. And we have statistical tools available to us to deal with that. The performance of a race team on a given weekend is a team success of which the driver is only one component. In addition, the organization around them, including the engineers and the crew chief that's on the top of the pit box, and then of course the car manufacturer. So we have developed a points added points added stat that breaks down the contribution between those four groups based on the tools used in the NBA. What we find is that the driver is the largest component by far. The best drivers we found are Kevin Harvick and Jeff Gordon. Surprisingly, Jimmy Johnson is not the top driver. We find that the organization is a big driving factor in his success as well.
It's interesting, since Loop data came into NASCAR in 2005, there's so many more stats that fans can pay attention to. Mike, the question for you is, how much of these stats do you pay attention to? What do you make use of in your operation to help you kind of tease out who the best drivers are and why they're good?
Well, traditionally it's been pure observation, but we have methods. We can't do a lot. We don't have data acquisition during the race, but we do a lot of pre and post processing through partners of what happens during the race. So we're able to catalog drivers, understand whether they're making critical mistakes. Do they make critical mistakes at the wrong time? Do they continually bring the car home without damage, things like that. So we can measure what they're doing from that aspect. We also look at how they perform throughout the race through post-processing. Some of that's provided to us from NASCAR, some of that we do on our own, but over time we're able to generate some information on different drivers and teams and how they perform, and it gives us a good idea of the type of driver that we're looking for. And we've seen some of the same things just through empirical data that Eric is working on nowadays, and it's fascinating to see how much the driver makes a contribution to the overall success, not only for a specific race, but for an entire season. And there's a lot to that, and the drivers that are capable of being successful on a weekly basis, but also across the course of the season or in our 10-race finale, it's very important to get that right, make the right decisions with the drivers that you choose.
Giacomo, what are F1 teams paying attention to?
Well, one of the problems that we started working on is in race strategy. And in order, because in F1, pit stop strategy, so when to pit, what tires to fit, is extremely important. And back when we started, you actually had refueling, now you don't. But still, your pit stop strategy, your decision about when to pit is very much contingent on when other teams will make that decision. And so because of that, we need to estimate a number of things. We need to be able to predict when other teams are going to make their cars, and that's a function of a number of variables. And so what we want to do is to be able to disambiguate between the speed of the car and the tire effect, so the tire degradation, and the impact of onboard fuel. And on top of that, there's the driver. And it turns out, at least in Formula One, that we can model the driver quite well by way of it's not quite a gamma distribution, but it looks like a gamma distribution. And you have to think about a car's performance as being, well, as the car is providing this envelope of performance over time. And that's very much a function of the underlying mechanics and aerodynamics of the car, and then the tires, and then the onboard fuel. And what the driver is doing is trying to ride that envelope of performance. And a very good driver will be able to get very, very close to that envelope, and a bad driver will sometimes perhaps get quite close, but other times they'll be quite erratic in riding that envelope. And in fact, it's a little bit messier than that, because how a driver drives the car will impact what that envelope looks like over time. So they can use up the tires more quickly. For example, Button in Formula One is especially with last year's Pirelli tires, had a reputation for being able to conserve the tires, and so it was typically faster than the drivers towards the latter part of his stints. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do, I mean, that estimation problem is useful and important for race strategy, but it's also some of the analysis that goes to explain, well, that goes to trying to work out who are the best drivers. And so we were talking about this before the panel started. One of the big changes and everything in the driver lineup for the 2013 season in Formula One is that Lewis Hamilton has left McLaren and moved to Mercedes. And what McLaren had to react to that, and they ultimately went to pick up Sergio Perez, who was sitting in a Sauber last year. And how they arrived at that decision was on the back of a great deal of data that they'd gathered and agglomerated and analyzed about all drivers, not just drivers in Formula One, but also other prospects. And on the back of all of that analysis, they were able to say Sergio Perez was a valid candidate.
JR, I know you've had a chance to get behind a lot of different types of wheels. What is your sense of the driver's contribution in different circuits and where a driver has the most amount of impact?
Yeah, I think that you look at situations that the variability of on-track conditions is higher. I think the driver typically has a larger effect on what's going on. There's a lot of, for IndyCar as an example, you show up at a 1.5 mile oval that the cars are going, you're flat out going 225, that a lot of your speed in that situation comes down to how fast the car can actually go. So in that particular instance, it's much more of an engineering exercise to qualify on the pole than it is a driving exercise to do as such. Now going to a street course where the difference between your fastest lap in the first session on a dirty racetrack and your fastest lap in qualifying a day and a half later after there's been hundreds of laps put down can be 4 or 5 seconds. You've got alternate tires that you're going to be putting on for the first time in qualifying. Things like that. It's much more of a probably even mix of the engineering team and the driver figuring out what do we need to do preemptively to make the car so it's at its optimal state going into this upcoming session. But then from a driving perspective, where is that extra lap time going to come from? If you've got 2 or 3 laps where the tires are at their best, understanding how that's going to affect the way that the car works in different corners, also based on the setup changes that you've made. There's a lot of that is, the onus does fall on the driver to figure that out and to go out and execute. And so from that perspective, I think it's it's fairly changeable depending on the circumstance and depending on the series. Formula One is a series right now that's very dependent on the aerodynamics being at an optimized level going to a specific racetrack. There's a extreme level of simulation that goes on before you will even show up, and that by the time you arrive at a race weekend, it's besides amongst the top few that are all at the highest level, it's already more or less sort of set in stone where teams are going to fall. The driver can certainly make some difference at that point, but I think even in F1, you go to tracks where the mechanical balance of the car, the sort of more street course Singapore stands out as a good example of that. Those things start to fall a little bit more in the driver's hands because the conditions are changing much more rapidly. I think that, the other element to it from a driving perspective, as we talk about more data being available to be collected, I think that also allows the driver, in a sense it can be used to figure out which drivers are better or where one driver is faster than another, but from a driving perspective, we can also use that data in the same way. So you look at teammates working with each other. You have one guy that goes out and is 2 or 3 tenths of a second a lap faster than the other guy. Those drivers can both come in at the end of that session, overlay each other's data, and look at where one guy is better than the other, how he's doing that. It's braking later with more brake pressure, and that's shaving off a half a tenth going into one corner. The driver that wasn't doing that can go out and try to replicate that same time difference. So there's a lot of ways that I think the drivers, now more than ever, are able to also use the data analysis to come up with means of improving their own personal performance for when they get out on the track.
Mike, at what level do your drivers use data? How much do you feed them? How much do you worry about data overload?
Well, we're very data driven. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have access to data throughout the race. We do have data that we can compare from practice sessions leading up to the race. So it's very important for our drivers to do a review of that data after their sessions. To a certain extent, they can do it during sessions. So like JR said, our teammates are comparing lines versus each other. It's something that we are really excited about because we haven't always had that access until the fuel injection systems came along last year. So now in the Cup Series, we're doing in-session data compares. The guys are again looking where that extra tenth or 2 tenths is coming from the other guys. So it's important for us during the sessions. We actually have access to the race data after the race is over, so we do quite a bit of post-processing and comparing on that as well.
David, your company has completely changed the way that fans now watch races. What is your sense of how much smarter fans have gotten because of the data they now have access to, the experience they now have because of what your company provides?
Well, I think it just gives them a better understanding of all the stuff that everybody's talking about here. The teams have all this data, the drivers have the data to get better, so now the fans actually can start to use that data and understand what's happening on the race. So, we have a second screen product on mobile and on the PC that allows fans to follow their favorite driver. It has all of the stats that's taking place, the telemetry for that driver, so they're really getting to understand what all these guys are talking about from a fan perspective. So it just makes the sport more interesting. If you look at the past, it was a lot about points and wins. That's kind of the two stats that were about motorsports. But now there's a tremendous amount of data from telemetry to steering data, all of that just making that experience much more robust for the fans.
JR, when you're engaging with fans, do you have a sense that they've gotten smarter? Or
So.
is too much knowledge a dangerous
I
thing?
certainly like to think so, I guess.
Yeah.
I think that, in a general sense, people are much more aware of, and I think you see this in motorsports just across the board. I think it's more commonly agreed upon that drivers are athletes, and I think that's due to a lot of the data collection that you're able to see, whether it's physical data collection from what the drivers are going through, their heart rates through the race or that type of thing, or just seeing what the cars are really capable of doing. I mean, I think when you really think about it, you know, whether it's oval, road course, you know, I think for us, you talk about a permanent road course, you know, for us, we go to Laguna Seca or Mid-Ohio or places here in the U.S. that the cars will do 3 or 4G in any direction constantly. And so, you know, it becomes a lot of stress on the body. And I think for fans to be able to sort of get a sense for what that's like and to see the types of things that the cars can do, the rate of acceleration, how quickly they brake, all these types of things, that's become much more than just a visual reference marker that you're watching on the TV. It's something that you can start to feel and really understand. And so I think from that perspective, I think the average fan, you know, and in NASCAR, I mean, you know, you watch NASCAR qualifying or during a race, looking through all the onboard telemetry, I've found to be very interesting to see how that plays a role in the strategy. You're talking about Daytona doing the restrictor plate racing, where guys are kind of half throttle and how they're trying to use the momentum of the draft and all these types of things, that it's become much easier to be educated about what's really happening. And because of that, I think the fan base in general has started paying more attention to it.
Eric, one of the great breakthroughs of baseball analytics is taking a look at a guy's minor league stats and being able to translate that into major league performance. Basically taking the stats and understanding which guy is going to translate best to the big leagues. Is there anything that allows you to say, look at a nationwide driver and say, that guy has the statistical profile of a guy who would be great on Sprint Cup?
That's something that we've just started to look at. I did a little mini analysis around Ricky Stenhouse Jr., who of course is a very accomplished nationwide driver, now moving to the Sprint Cup this year. What we found is, and what's unique about, another thing that's unique about Ricky, in addition to the fact that he's a very accomplished driver, is that he's moving to a very top tier, very accomplished team in Roush. And what we found is that looking over the past about 10 years of data, we found 4 comparable drivers, and we found that in general their average position performance in nationwide dropped by about 9 spots in moving from one level to the next. So that we expect, based on that Stenhouse might have an average finish position of somewhere between 16 to 18 this coming year, which would put him in sort of just outside the chase contention range, and might be able to get in there with a little bit of luck. And I think, you know, we'll continue to see additional analyses like that as we increase our sophistication of the analysis we're doing. Another thing that's been very interesting to note on pit row is the importance of victories. And I know that's not anything revolutionary, but there's a good saying that anyone can lose a race, but not anyone can win a race. There's actually more information contained in a victory than any other position. An average driver can finish 10th place, or an average team, I should say, could finish 10th place. A team that has non-ideal equipment can finish 10th place. A top team can finish 10th place. Only a really top team can generally finish in first place. So victories is an important metric as well.
Mike, when you guys were deciding to put Joey Logano in a car, what data were you looking at?
Well, to begin with, he's one of the most experienced young guys that's out there right now. If you look at it, he's 22 years old. He's been in the Sprint Cup Series for quite a few years now, has a ton of nationwide experience. So we felt like from a learning curve perspective and the amount of time he has in the future to continue to grow, we thought that we were able to get him at the right time. So again, we continuously look at how drivers perform in both series, be it the Cup, the Nationwide Series, and also to a certain extent, depending on who we're following, the Truck Series or some of the feeder series. But he obviously has incredible results in the Nationwide Series, and our hope is that he's had a few seasons now to mature, learn the Cup Series, the differences between that and the Nationwide Series. It'll be a good driver for us for the future. We feel like he can get results right now and also continue to get better in time.
It's interesting, JR, I'm going to ask you a question because, you know, we talk a lot about these hard data points that you guys are using, and to me, what's interesting about putting Joey in a car and deciding that he was going to translate is there's some soft data questions you kind of have to ask yourself. You know, why a driver might have a good day versus a bad day, you know, how he's going to handle the grind of a long season, how he's going to psychologically deal with being in the back of the pack versus the front of the pack. JR, I'm just kind of curious how much thought you put into why you have a good day and why you might have a bad day.
I mean, I think it's, as anybody that has to perform in any form of athletics or sport, those are things that you have to consider, because I think at some level you have to recognize as the guy between they call it the nut between the steering wheel and the whatever airbox, that you have to be, that you're responsible for your own performance. And so when you get out there, you have to know that you're at your optimum state of, whether it's a psychological thing or it's an emotional thing for some guys, or, strictly just a mental state to get out there, a mental attitude to get out there and perform at your best. And so I think that a lot of that gets weeded out on the way up to, guys don't win nationwide championships or Indy Lights championships or GP2 without having that sort of dialed in to a pretty, honed into a pretty significant extent already, I think. But that even from there, I think you see so frequently in stick and ball sports how, some guys want the ball, and they want to take the three when the game's on the line, and some guys just don't respond well to that type of pressure or that type of situation. I think that it's my opinion, at least, that those are sort of trainable skills to deal with. And that in the motorsports field, there's a variety of different companies and means of training yourself to do things better. And that's actually become a very interesting set of data that has been collected over the last 5 or 10 years in particular, from different drivers being able to go through these programs and how they rank against each other, doing varying types of visual scanning tasks and things like that measure attention span over a period of time, your ability to quickly recognize something that's going on. And so I think that from a driving perspective, because as the data sets become more complex from the car side of things, from the engineering side of things, I think the drivers will so too have to become much more finely tuned to really be able to take advantage. Because if you talk about racing in the 70s or something, the whole field of a NASCAR race or a Formula One race or an IndyCar race, there'd be 2 guys on the lead lap by the end of the race or something. You had everything was totally spread out because the variability was huge. We're now in a position where, if you can be a quarter of a tenth of a second better every lap of a race because you're doing something a little bit better than the other guy, or you're prepared a little bit better than the other guy, that can be the difference between first and 8th or 10th by the time everything works out. So I think the mental adjustment or the psychological adjustment of the driver will only become a bigger element to outright speed as we go forward.
Jacko, how much is F1 paying attention to driver psychology and how to maximize driver performance?
I think anecdotally, there are plenty of instances. When I was working for Renault and Lotus Renault, my first boss, Pat Simmons, he would always talk about the importance of psychology. And he talked about, let's say, the perhaps more nefarious impact that telemetry can have. JR talked about, let's say, doing driver compares and sometimes showing, let's say, a slower driver where he's slower and what, not just where he's slower, but also the driver inputs perhaps that the faster driver is doing, how he's braking, exactly how he's steering, how he's coping with oversteer in parts of his stint. That can have a devastating impact psychologically. So he was actually wary sometimes about not showing too detailed telemetry for that very reason. But speaking to the more general point about what drivers can do to improve their performance, I know that NHL teams are quite cognizant of the fact that regulating circadian rhythms can have an impact on players' performance, and the same is very, very true of F1 teams. They're a lot more careful today about where their drivers spend their time and how they move from one race to another, because we're talking about spanning races that span multiple time zones. But the idea about using data to improve performance is being used in Formula One and in other companies, even at the level of the work taking place at the factory. It's not just the drivers, but F1 teams now are also being much more careful about collecting telemetry, if you will, about the engineers back at the factory, about how these drivers are carrying out work, about how they're spending their time, about the working out the marginal impact of having, let's say, 5 simultaneous projects versus 3, about patterns of communication between engineers as they collaborate on projects, and trying to use this data to improve productivity. And ultimately, this is changing how effective, how efficient teams can be in driving development.
Mike, Mike, my question for you is, Brad obviously makes a point about letting people know he's not a cookie cutter driver. Have you guys put much thought into what it means to not have a cookie cutter driver in terms of how he relates to his teammates and what that means, the impact it has on the team?
You're talking about in terms of Brad?
Yeah.
He's definitely a different guy for sure. He's got his own rhythm, but I think from our perspective, and at the end of the day, we're about results, we're about wins and championships, and I think that he has a different approach when it comes to what it takes to be a successful driver, what it takes to be winning and championship driver, and a lot of that is in his preparation. He is a very good student of the game, of other drivers. I can remember when he first came to drive for us, he would talk about this driver behaves this way, this driver prepares this way. So I think that what makes him different or what makes him stand out is just his preparation, his understanding of the game or the drivers and the people that he's racing against, because our cars and our races are not always about the person that has the least amount of fear. I think you would see there's some drivers that you've seen in our sport that probably would have been a lot more successful if it was purely based off of who was the least scared. Maybe that comes up sometimes in qualifying, I don't know, or in certain situations in the race, but for us, you need a driver who's a tactician, someone who understands how the race plays out, what's going to happen during the race, how the changing conditions are going to affect the car. It's sort of like I equate it to driving a lawnmower or a tractor or something like that. I need to move this switch this direction now. I need to pull the throttle back this direction now. I need to steer this much this time. I need to steer this much the next time. So, you're sort of at a control panel pressing different buttons in the racing that we have, as opposed to just really holding the wheel tight and trying to go faster and faster every lap. So I think that's some of the keys to his success and what attracts us to him as a driver.
And I know there are a number of NBA teams now, and a couple baseball teams that are getting into psychological testing to try to turn these soft data points into hard data. Is there any compatibility tests or psychological testing that you guys are doing to optimize teamwork, making sure you have the right people teamed with the right people?
For me?
For everybody. This is an open question. But Mike, why don't you start?
Yeah, we've started to work in that area, and everyone knows just from common sense that there's certain people that can work together, certain people that can't based off personalities, but digging deeper into that and trying to understand our driver-crew chief relationships. One of the things that we haven't talked about at all that's important in our racing series are pit stops. We have guys on the wall that have to jump off the wall in front of a moving car and do a stop in 12 seconds. And the ability to be able to jump over, to make all the right moves and orchestrate a group of 6 guys at one time is very important. You throw in the mental factor of the fact that you're coming in leading the race, and there are millions of people that are going to know that it was your fault if you leave pit road in second place. So we started to work in those areas as well to try to understand when we bring in a pit crew member, when we're training a guy at the lower levels to be a Sprint Cup pit crew member, what abilities do they have walking in the door? What mental profile do they have walking in the door? And are they going to hit all the right hurdles through the process, but then get to the most important race of the year and crack. So, yeah, there's a lot to that. The psychology of pit crew members as well as drivers, crew chiefs, and all those things. And we've done some work there and continue to try to build a database of what profile do these type people need to meet, and what profiles work well together to have a successful team.
JR said something really interesting that the Illinois men's basketball coach recently banned his players from using Twitter. And since doing that, they went 5-1. Now, there's no way of knowing whether there's correlation there, causation there. But I'm just kind of curious, do you think about that sort of stuff, how your sleep schedule or the way stuff you do that has nothing related to the race impacts your performance?
I think you have to think about it. The question then becomes like, how much control over a lot of that do you really have? A lot of times if you got to be at the track early and you're up late with a sponsor function or something on a race weekend, there's kind of nothing you can do about that. So you sort of balance, I think, the thought process between, what are things that I can think of ahead of time that'll help me, manage my time better. Because I think when it comes down to it, whether it's flights or it's appearances or it's, strictly stuff on a race weekend, it's all about time management, really, like what you're doing during specific pieces of time to be best prepared for whatever's up next. But I think you also invariably have to just look at it as, how can I cope best with the situations that I'm going to be in? I mean, I think that auto racing these days in particular has become very, sort of business oriented, commercial oriented, that, I think drivers have, a lot of different responsibilities that maybe once weren't there. And so not only does that play I think ends up playing a role in where drivers end up and what drivers have what roles and what teams they're with and all that kind of stuff, but it also affects how you get through a race weekend and the types of kind of duties that you have to fulfill, as you go along. So those are all things that I think you recognize as a driver and as a team that you have to be cognizant of. And I guess I'd say it's certainly not a science as far as how to deal with that, but there are definitely things that you talk about and deal with.
So you'd like to see some data on a correlation between number of sponsor functions and race weekend results?
Yeah, I would like that. I think I could get them skewed, so maybe I had a few less things to do over a weekend.
Yeah, I think our drivers would be interested in that as well. We have to pay the bills though, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I think there's one F1 driver in particular whose identity I will not reveal in case this is embarrassing for him, who's very much a fan of the quantified self movement. I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with it, but it's this movement where people are collecting data about themselves, and to a large extent, the data that they're gathering is enabled by a lot of the devices that we use, by smartphones, through smartphone apps. So it's measuring things, for example, like how much movement and everything, how much you move during your sleep, which might be a proxy for REM sleep. They take their heart rate a number of times throughout the day and everything. There's a number of different other trinkets and everything that can be plugged into these apps and everything, so that they can sort of get biometric readings, and also, and rather crucially, are measuring how they spend their day and how they allocate that time and the impact that it has against certain other outputs, metrics that they care about. But I'm a little. I think that's very exciting. On the one hand, we have to be very careful though about experiments with a sample set of one. And at the same time, though, I think there's the prospect for collecting data this way in a very unobtrusive fashion is better, I think, and especially when we scale across an organization, across a company, across 500 engineers or so, than it is, and I think ultimately this kind of data is more valuable than, let's say, gathering psychological profile data. I mean, we've tried to do this a little bit, looking at Myers-Briggs profiles, for example, and trying to look at how to work out what the composition of certain teams, the impact that the composition of certain teams in terms of the profiles that they consist of against certain outputs, like the performance of that team in completing certain tasks. And we haven't been able to get very good results and everything. We haven't been able to really get clear-cut results as to what the right composition of team assessed this way is. And I think much more valuable will be the kind of data that we're increasingly being able to gather in large amounts. And that's basically what we can talk about telemetry again. And it's this data that's generated just by virtue of people going about their business. They don't have to self-report. They don't have to do anything at all. It's just collected automatically. And it's not perfect, but increasingly, this is perhaps a very nice way to create a data set against which we might be able to really understand what are the drivers of performance.
We could probably spend all day talking about what data we have now. I'm kind of curious what's coming next. David, what do you guys have coming next that fans are going to be excited about?
Well, I think given the new ECU that's on the Sprint Cup cars, there's a tremendous amount of data there that we're continuing to work with NASCAR to open that up. So the whole fuel injection and how the fuel mixtures are relating to performance of the cars, it's just a tremendous amount of information there that we're going to hopefully get NASCAR to open up so that we can share. So we know the data's there. NASCAR's been a bit resistant on giving us that data. But I think, again, it'll just open up for the fans to see more about what it really takes to win a race and what goes into it.
A couple questions here from the audience that I wanted to get to. We have just a few minutes. I thought this was a great question. When it comes to testing and development, how do you balance what you learn from models, simulations, telemetry, et cetera, versus your other primary data source, the feel of the driver? Giacomo, why don't you?
I didn't quite catch that. There was an echo. If you could repeat it.
Oh, sorry, sure. So when it comes to all the data that you gather, through testing and development, how do you kind of pit that against your other primary data source, the feel of the driver?
The feel of the driver?
Yes. So.
Well, I mean, the fact is that the way that data is being collected, the way that data is collected, let's say, a typical F1 car has. Is instrumented differently from, let's say, in test conditions rather than in race conditions. But let's say in test conditions, you've got about anywhere between 150 and 250 types of sensors. And this is, I mean, you've got everything from pitot tubes, which are measuring like the velocity of flow over certain elements of the car, to the movement, the travel of different suspension parts, the dampers, to the steering inputs and everything provided by the driver, how the driver is braking. And all of this is used to being able to understand how the car is working and how the car is working with the driver. So that data is analyzed, is analyzed, let's say, for the benefit of being able to work out, let's say, how the car is working and how the driver is working with it. But it's also very much used to calibrate. This is a theme that we talked about earlier in the panel. It's used to calibrate virtual models of the car back at the factory, and to try to really understand and to calibrate these models so that then the drivers can get into these cars and work out their technique. And I think that, the fact is, though, the driver feel is a little bit nebulous and everything. Like when Raikkonen first started again with the Lotus team last year, for a good part of the season, like the kind of steering that he was used to at McLaren wasn't at all the kind of steering that he had in a Lotus and everything. He complained about it when Raikkonen moved to Ferrari. He complained about it, and Ferrari were able to make some small changes, everything that accommodated his driving style. And when he went to Lotus, it was very, very different. And the fact is that I know a number of the engineers there in trying to design around the kind of input, the kind of feel that Raikkonen wanted, was very difficult for them to do, because it was a feeling that they couldn't really get a good proxy for in the data that they were collecting. So, yeah, basically trying to account for driver feel, I think, is hard, maybe.
I mean, the heart of the question, right, is with all the data that we're solving for now, what role is there left for gut instinct? JR, how do you answer that question?
I mean, I think that there's certainly a role. I think there will always be a role in auto racing for gut instinct, whether it's the role of the driver to have some sense for the direction that the setup needs to go, or for a race strategist or the chief engineer that's calling the race, to be able to figure out pit stop strategy. I think one of the primary differences in Formula One to IndyCar, and then I think probably even more so than to NASCAR, is that sense of variability. When you talk about race strategy, it's rare in a Formula One race that a yellow or caution occurs, so you end up with a safety car. And so I think from that perspective, that's not something that you're really taking into consideration as you're developing your race strategy. It's primarily about the speed of the other drivers, trying to predict when they're going to pit, to your point earlier, and working around that to form the best strategy based on some fairly concrete factors as you work them out going forward. I think for us, particularly we go to street course races where it's easy to knock a wing off or somebody gets stuck in a tire barrier or something like that. A lot of the metrics that we look at as far as how we predict what's going to happen are based off of historical data on where yellows fell in previous events at this track based on track configuration and doing double file restarts versus single file restarts or things like that. I think, my sense would be that in NASCAR that's maybe an even bigger factor of it because pit stops so frequently go along with yellow flags and all that type of stuff, just because there's more of them through the duration of a race. But that, I think from a driving perspective, I think as I spoke to earlier in the discussion, the more variability there is in track condition and, how the cars are going to work, I think the driver potentially has a bigger impact on the decision that ends up being made, because some of it does come down to where is it going to go next, and that's frequently a difficult question to answer just based on the data that you have from that session.
So to follow up on that, we recently had a discussion with a network TV partner about slip angle. So we can tell via data where the car is headed, but the question that came up was, well, is tight loose really a data point, or is it really a feel? Is it a driver feel? So how the driver may be communicating back to his team about what he thinks is tight or loose may not necessarily match the data point that we're showing. So that was kind of an interesting discussion where the driver's feel of tight and loose may not necessarily be the same that we're reporting in terms of a specific data point.
And I think that there, when you talk about oval racing, I think that there are frequently situations where it's a matter of how loose can the driver deal with the car being. That's just kind of up to the driver and the team to come to, some, conclusion about, it's frequent. It sounds stupid. It's seems like a very, Days of Thunder type of comment, but it's frequent that a car that's a little bit more what we'd say neutral or a little bit on the loose side is faster. And so can the driver deal with it being like that for an entire stint during the race? Can it deal with that for it being like that for the entire race? And then it inevitably comes down to, does the driver think, based on what they've done in practice, that it's going to become too difficult to deal with, even if it's it's manageable for 5 or 10 laps. So I think that the data and the driver's feedback ideally will go hand in hand, and that the team will be able to use both of those things to figure out, to either back up what the driver's saying or to, create some element of discussion to figure out what needs to happen next.
So our final data point of the day is this. We have 0 minutes left. Fortunately, I'd love to keep this going. I could talk for another 2 hours. We'll have to pick it up next year. I hope we can. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This was a great conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here. And thank you.